Dawn, November 19, 1944. Off northern Luzon, the sea lay flat and metallic. A gray plate under low cloud, diesel smoke hanging sweet and oily above a line of 13 transports and 6 escorts. Men on deck tasted salt and bunker soot on the wind and watched the color seep into the water as the sun climbed. Lookouts muttered that the sky was clear and the sea quiet. Then the quiet betrayed them. A shiver ran through the column, first a dull thump beneath one freighter, then a second hammer blow under another, and fountains of black water and oil burst upward. From somewhere below, unseen, wakeless fish had come on straight tracks. Within minutes, 2 transports were broken, their holds coughing flame. Paint blistered, lifeboat tackle jammed, steel shrieked as plates buckled. A petty officer later said the sea boiled around him. Fuel slicks caught fire in veined patterns, and the smoke tasted of cordite and cargo. Survivors kicked clear of spinning debris, while escorts raked the empty surface with gunfire and rolled patterns of depth charges into silence. The names of the attacking boats were whispered in mess lines and after-action rumors, Celion, Pintado, while others swore there had to be more. By late 1944, Japan's lifeline was failing. U.S. submarines, barely a few percent of the Navy's manpower, had already sunk over half of Japan's merchant tonnage, and every convoy felt it. Drifting under a sky stained brown with smoke, men asked the same question. How had the Americans turned open water into a killing ground? The answer lies in the tools, doctrine, and intelligence that reshaped the hunt, our next step into the Silent Services War. Before the Pacific exploded into war, Japan's empire was a maritime web, a vast lattice of shipping routes binding resource to factory, colony to capital. Every ton of coal mined in Korea, every sack of rice from Burma, every barrel of oil from the Dutch East Indies traveled across this lifeline. In 1941, Japan's merchant marine numbered more than 6,300 vessels, totaling over 6 million gross tons, crewed by nearly 200,000 sailors. These ships were not mere transports. They were the arteries of an empire that lived or died by the sea. From Osaka and Yokohama, freighters steamed southward through the Formosa Strait, hugging the coasts of China, then branching toward Singapore, Saigon, and Balikpapan. Tankers carried crude to the refineries at Palembang and back again to the shipyards of Kure and Yokosuka. To lose even a fraction of these routes was to starve the empire itself. Yet Tokyo's naval strategists scarcely imagined such a collapse. The Imperial Japanese Navy, brilliant in its pursuit of carrier warfare, believed victory would hinge on one decisive fleet battle, a modern Tsushima fought in the Central Pacific. Submarines were trained not to hunt merchantmen, but to scout enemy fleets and strike battleships. Convoy defense was dismissed as unglamorous, almost beneath the warrior code. Even when war began, Japan's confidence remained buoyed by rapid conquests. Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all achieved in a matter of months. But each new conquest stretched supply lines farther, forcing the same dwindling number of freighters to haul oil, bauxite, coal, and food thousands of miles through waters increasingly watched by an enemy adapting to the ocean's demands. When the United States entered the war, its submarine arm was still shackled by cautious rules of engagement and plagued by faulty torpedoes that often failed to detonate. Yet the geography of the Pacific favored learning. Endless lanes, few escorts, and targets too valuable to hide. By mid-1942, American submariners, once unsure commerce raiders, were beginning to strike with growing confidence. Japan's great maritime network, built over decades of expansion, had become the very vulnerability that would doom its empire. By 1943, the ocean's most feared hunters were neither destroyers nor cruisers, but long, lean shapes of steel gliding beneath the waves. The U.S. Navy's Silent Service drew its strength from 3 primary designs, the Gato, Balao, and Tench classes. Each stretched more than 300 feet, with pressure hulls thick enough to survive dives past 400 feet. They displaced over 1,500 tons and carried 4 powerful Fairbanks-Morse diesel engines for surface running, paired with electric motors for silent submerged travel. On the surface, they could make 20 knots. Underwater, they crept at 9. Inside, space was measured in inches, hot, cramped, and dense with the smell of oil, sweat, and ozone. Yet these boats carried the war's most devastating weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo. It was meant to be perfect, 20 feet long, nearly 2 tons in weight, with a 643-pound warhead capable of breaking the spine of any ship afloat. In theory, the weapon gave America control of the sea's depths. In practice, it betrayed its crews. Between December 1941 and late 1943, almost half of all Mark 14s either ran too deep, failed to explode, or detonated prematurely. Submariners risked everything, slipping past escorts, firing point blank, and then watched in disbelief as torpedoes struck cleanly and bounced off the hulls. Some missed entirely, running 10 or 15 feet below their intended depth. The Bureau of Ordnance dismissed the complaints, insisting the crews were at fault. It took Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, to defy orders and run live fire tests near Australia. The results were irrefutable. The magnetic exploders were faulty, and the depth mechanisms miscalibrated. By autumn 1943, the fixes began to arrive. Torpedoes finally ran true, and the ocean itself seemed to change character. Now, when a Mark 14 struck, a single hit could lift a freighter clear of the surface, split its plates, and send it under in minutes. The silent service, barely 2% of the Navy's personnel, would go on to sink more than half of all Japanese ships destroyed in the war. With the weapon now worthy of the hunters who fired it, the Pacific became a silent battlefield, where one unseen volley could decide the fate of an empire. By early 1943, the mood aboard America's submarines had hardened from frustration to grim precision. The early months of failure, torpedoes that ran too deep, detonators that misfired, were giving way to a new confidence. The crews of the USS Pickerel, Grenadier, and Trigger had learned patience, stealth, and teamwork. Their boats now prowled the waters of New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea, where Japanese convoys ran lifelines to embattled garrisons at Lae and Salamaua. On March 2, 1943, under overcast skies and squalls that smelled of salt and aviation fuel, an 8-ship Japanese convoy crept northward from Rabaul. Packed with nearly 7,000 troops and tons of supplies, American reconnaissance spotted the movement. The next day, Allied bombers from the 5th Air Force descended in waves, turning the sea into a furnace. Transports exploded, destroyers burned to their waterlines, and hundreds of soldiers clung to oil-slicked wreckage. When the smoke cleared, the silent service moved in. Pickerel and Grenadier slid through drifting debris and burning cargo, their periscopes slicing the surface like knives. They fired at crippled transports that still floated stubbornly, sending them down with single, clean hits. The submarines also picked up surviving Allied airmen who had ditched during the strikes, a rare moment when machines built to kill became instruments of rescue. For the first time, submarines worked seamlessly with surface and air units, each complementing the other's reach. In the months that followed, the lessons of the Bismarck Sea spread through the fleet. Convoys that once steamed with confidence began vanishing under the waves. Later that year, convoy HI-20 bound for Singapore met the same fate, its tankers gutted by torpedoes from coordinated wolf packs. Japanese survivors spoke of invisible wolves that attacked without sound or mercy. The tide had turned. The Pacific, once Japan's open highway, was tightening into a noose, and the Imperial Navy was only beginning to grasp the scale of the unseen war raging beneath its ships. By the closing months of 1943, alarm was spreading through Tokyo's naval headquarters. Reports arriving from the South China Sea and the Philippine routes spoke of convoys that simply vanished, tankers, freighters, and troop ships gone without a trace. That year alone, more than 200 Japanese vessels were lost, and the Imperial Navy finally acknowledged what it had long ignored. The undersea war was real, and it was destroying the empire from beneath. Intelligence officers compiled maps marked with growing clusters of sinkings, red pins tracing an invisible siege from the Marshalls to the Strait of Formosa. Conferences convened in urgency to discuss kaibote, new escort craft meant to shield merchantmen. Yet the plans faltered before they began. Japan lacked steel, diesel fuel, and time. The few escorts that did leave the yards were too few, too slow, and poorly equipped. Merchant captains wrote home in despair. One survivor described a metal shark that rose in silence before shells raked the lifeboats. Others begged for convoy protection, refusing to sail unless destroyers accompanied them. But those destroyers, needed elsewhere, were already stretched thin. The Imperial Navy's sonar, the Type 93, could barely detect a submarine beyond a few hundred meters. Depth charges were crude and radar almost non-existent, leaving escorts effectively blind once the sun went down. To the men at sea, American submarines seemed supernatural. Torpedoes came from nowhere, ships exploded without warning, and survivors rarely saw their attackers. In truth, there was no magic, only mastery. At Pearl Harbor and in Australia, the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, and the Ultra Cryptanalysis teams were reading Japanese naval codes in near real time. Convoy routes, departure times, even cargo manifests reached submarine captains days in advance. Commanders like Eugene Fluckey of Barb, Richard O'Kane of Tang, and Dudley Mush Morton of Wahoo turned that intelligence into art, striking precisely where the enemy least expected. To Japan's sailors, it felt as though the sea itself had turned traitor. By the year's end, Tokyo finally understood the truth it had tried to ignore. Its empire was being strangled not by great fleets, but by unseen hunters, cutting its lifelines one ship at a time. In war, numbers tell their own story, and by 1943, the balance between Japan and the United States had become a contest of industry as much as arms. While Japan's shipyards struggled beneath bombing raids, blackout restrictions, and desperate material shortages, America's industrial engine was hitting full stride. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States launched 288 fleet submarines and produced more than 14,000 torpedoes, an industrial miracle fueled by the assembly line precision of Groton, Portsmouth, and Manitowoc. Steel, copper, and precision instruments flowed from factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh straight into the hulls of Gato, Balao, and Tench-class boats. Each submarine cost roughly $6 million, more than a dozen B-17 bombers, but delivered a return measured in tankers and troop ships sunk. The Navy's Bureau of Ships had turned the process into a science, streamlined hull designs, standardized parts, and mass training pipelines that could replace combat losses almost before they were felt. Behind the combat patrols stretched a vast logistical web. Forward bases at Fremantle, Brisbane, Midway, and Pearl Harbor pulsed with 24-hour maintenance and refit rotations. Submarines returned from patrols blackened by salt and oil were resupplied within days and sent back into the deep with fresh crews and full torpedo rooms. Submarine tenders like USS Fulton, Bushnell, and Peleus functioned as floating factories, refueling, rearming, even replacing engines and periscopes at anchor. Supply convoys delivered diesel, spare parts, and frozen food to outposts across the Pacific, ensuring that the silent service never lacked what it needed to fight. Japan had no such cushion. Its shipyards, choked by bomb damage and resource scarcity, could not replace lost freighters. By late 1944, less than 3 million tons of merchant shipping remained afloat, barely half the capacity needed to feed its population or fuel its navy. Coal from Korea and rice from Indochina piled up at docks, with no hulls left to carry them. The empire was beginning to starve. Meanwhile, in Washington and Pearl Harbor, the Submarine Operations Research Group, scientists and officers working, side by side, used mathematical analysis to plot convoy routes and assign patrol zones with ruthless efficiency. The campaign had evolved into a war of data and discipline, where every patrol was part of a larger design. America's shipbuilders, logisticians, and code breakers had forged an invisible weapon, an ocean that answered to them. For Japan, there would be no replacing what the depths had claimed. By the autumn of 1944, Japan's last strategic hope, the defense of the Philippines, rested on convoys that could no longer survive the journey. Operation SHO-1, the grand plan to reinforce Luzon and Leyte, demanded that fuel, ammunition, and troops cross the South China Sea from Formosa and the home islands. Yet every route through those waters had become a hunting ground. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding the U.S. Submarine Force Pacific, had begun organizing wolf packs, coordinated groups of 3 submarines that shared intelligence, radar contacts, and kill zones. Boats like Celeon II, Growler, and Pintado prowled the Luzon Strait in loose formations, their captains linked by radio silence broken only to confirm destruction. The results were merciless. Between October and December 1944, American submarines sent more than 150 Japanese ships to the bottom, among them tankers whose cargoes were measured in the lifeblood of the Imperial Navy. Convoy HI-81, bound for the Philippines in November, carried reinforcements, supplies, and the escort carrier Shinyo. The Celeon II found them in the night. 2 spreads of torpedoes hit home. The tanker Awagawa Maru erupted first, followed moments later by Shinyo, whose aviation fuel turned the sea into an inferno. Survivors recalled water aflame for miles, the surface coated in burning oil that clung to skin and steel alike. Destroyers circled wildly, dropping depth charges into empty water as the submarines slipped away, unseen and untouched. The Imperial Navy's response was desperate. Even destroyers once reserved for fleet actions were reassigned to convoy duty, their speed wasted on futile escorts. Yet it changed nothing. The American wolf packs had transformed the undersea war into a system of annihilation, an industrial rhythm of detection, attack, and disappearance. Japan's convoys no longer moved men and material. They fed the ocean's hunger. By the time U.S. forces landed at Leyte Gulf, the Empire's merchant fleet was already dead in spirit. Only the hulls still floated, waiting for their turn to vanish beneath the black water. By 1945, the sea itself had turned against Japan. Sailors began calling it Shiroi Haka, the White Grave. Each voyage southward toward Formosa or the Philippines felt like a death sentence written in salt and steel. Convoy service, once routine duty, had become a punishment. Crews lashed paper amulets to railings, prayed to sea spirits, and refused to sleep below decks, fearing they would never reach the ladders if torpedoes struck in the night. The veterans spoke of phantom wakes streaking across calm water. Imagined periscopes, false splashes, symptoms of a collective terror born from months of invisible slaughter. It was a war where men died without seeing their killers, and where survival itself began to feel like guilt. Even those outside the Navy were not spared. Allied prisoners of war, packed into unmarked hell ships, such as Arisan Maru and Rakuyo Maru, endured the same nightmare. When American submarines unknowingly torpedoed these transports, the explosions left almost no survivors. The sea that had once fed Japan's empire now devoured its victims indiscriminately. Letters from merchant officers that reached home grew darker, filled with prayers and apologies. Some captains confessed to hallucinating the metallic gleam of torpedo tracks where none existed. Panic spread through the merchant service. Crews deserted, convoys sailed half-manned, and those who remained clutched their fear as tightly as their lifebelts. The psychological collapse echoed in Tokyo. Fuel shortages kept the fleet idle. Ships rusted in anchorages as morale disintegrated. By contrast, across the Pacific, the men of the silent service thrived within their steel coffins. Their patrols, lasted 60 days or more in suffocating heat and darkness, yet the shared danger bound them like family. Each boat carried its own insignia, its own identity. Submarines named for fish fought like wolves, competing to top tonnage charts posted at Pearl Harbor's submarine base. Commanders like Richard O'Kane and Eugene Fluckey became legends whispered across the fleet. For every Japanese lookout scanning black water in dread, there was an American officer peering through a periscope with calm precision. That imbalance of fear became a weapon as real as any torpedo. By 1945, Japan's defeat was not only material, but spiritual. The empire hollowed out from beneath, starved of ships, of courage, and of hope. By the summer of 1945, Japan's empire was dying, not in firestorms or invasions, but in silence. Beneath the surface, the U.S. Navy's submarines had completed one of the most devastating campaigns in naval history. Over 1,200 Japanese merchant ships and nearly 200 warships now rested on the ocean floor. More than 5 million tons of steel erased from the empire's lifeblood. What had begun as a nuisance had become total strangulation. Tankers from Borneo never reached the home islands. Rice from Indochina rotted in warehouses. Coal shipments from Korea dwindled to a trickle. The arteries of the empire had clotted. In Tokyo, production statistics told the truth that censors could no longer hide. Aircraft manufacturing dropped by half. Steel output collapsed for want of ore and transport. Factories that once forged Zero fighters stood idle, their machines coated with dust. Even training flights were curtailed because there was no fuel left to burn. The mighty Yamato herself, the largest battleship ever built, lay moored and motionless for months, her bunkers nearly empty. Admiral Soemu Toyota, chief of the combined fleet, admitted privately that the sea itself has turned against Japan. The ocean, once the empire's proudest highway, had become its enemy. The submarines had accomplished what strategic bombing could not, a strangulation so complete that by the time B-29 set Japan's cities ablaze in 1945, there was scarcely any fuel to fight the flames. Every blaze burned unchecked because fire engines stood dry. What the bombs destroyed, the blockade ensured, could never be rebuilt. When the war ended, analysts struggled to comprehend the scale of the achievement. The silent service, barely 2% of the U.S. Navy, had reduced an island nation to paralysis. Their success required no great fleets, no decisive battles, only patience, mathematics, and steel nerves. The Pacific balance had shifted forever, reshaped by unseen hunters who conquered not through glory, but through silence. Yet victory had a price, and the men who waged this invisible war bore scars as deep as the oceans they ruled. Victory beneath the waves carried a toll as heavy as the ships it claimed. Of the 288 American submarines that sailed into the Pacific, 52 never came home. 52 steel coffins resting forever on the seabed, with more than 3,500 men entombed inside. Their losses came in every form imaginable: depth charges that crushed hulls like tin, mines that detonated without warning, mechanical failures in silent darkness. Some vanished without a signal, their last radio messages cheerful and routine. For decades afterward, their patrol zones would be marked simply as overdue, presumed lost. Early failures had already cost dearly. The Mark 14 torpedo's defects turned bold attacks into disasters, forcing crews to close dangerously near before firing. Even after the weapon was fixed, the enemy adapted. Japanese escorts grew more aggressive, deploying improved sonar and coordinated counterattacks. Legendary boats like Wahoo under Dudley, Mush Morton, and Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane, met their ends late in the war. Wahoo lost to aerial bombs in the Sea of Japan. Tang destroyed by her own malfunctioning torpedo. Their deaths reminded every submariner how thin the line was between hunter and hunted. Moral wounds cut even deeper. American crews sometimes torpedoed unmarked hell ships carrying Allied prisoners of war, unaware of their human cargo until too late. Survivors of those patrols carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Yet from every loss, the service learned. The Navy refined sonar tactics, improved radar for night attacks, and introduced wolfpack coordination to multiply striking power while spreading risk. Air reconnaissance began feeding precise target data to subs lying in wait, turning improvisation into art. By 1945, the silent service had become a disciplined instrument of strategy, its perfection born not of flawlessness, but of relentless adaptation. From the first misfired torpedoes to synchronized convoy ambushes, the American undersea fleet proved that mastery is forged in error and paid for in blood. And though peace would soon return to the Pacific, the lessons of those depths would never fade. When Japan's surrender echoed across Tokyo Bay in August 1945, the submariners of the silent service surfaced into a world that scarcely understood what they had achieved. Their campaign had been waged without spectacle, no grand fleet engagements, no flag-raising photographs, yet it had done what few thought possible. Japan's merchant tonnage, once over 6 million gross tons, had been reduced to barely a quarter of that. The undersea blockade had starved an empire, cut its armies from their supplies, and brought an island nation to its knees. Historians would later call it the most effective naval offensive ever waged by so small a force. In the months that followed, the Navy began dissecting its own success. Technical officers pored over patrol reports, sonar logs, and torpedo data, recognizing that the lessons of the Pacific would define the future. Submarine doctrine shifted permanently from auxiliary scouting to independent strategic warfare. Wartime Balao-class designs evolved into the post-war Guppy conversions, streamlined, faster, and optimized for submerged endurance. A decade later, those same principles gave birth to USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, whose lineage could be traced directly back to the diesel hunters of 1944. What had begun as improvisation in war had become the blueprint for the atomic age. Across the Pacific, Japan drew its own conclusions. Its newly formed maritime self-defense force made anti-submarine warfare its cornerstone, determined never again to be strangled from beneath the waves. For both nations, the lessons of the silent war became part of their naval DNA. Yet the true legacy was deeper than steel or doctrine. Beneath the calm surface of the Pacific lie thousands of men, American and Japanese, who vanished without graves, their ships sealed in eternal patrol. Their war was unseen, their victories unheralded, but their endurance reshaped history. Even in the nuclear era that followed, every submarine slipping silently into the deep carried their ghosts, whispering through the currents of a new age. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had grown quiet, but it was a silence born of ruin. Japan's empire no longer lived through conquest or commerce. It merely endured, starving within the ring of steel and depth that had closed around it. The same waters that had once carried expansion now guarded surrender. Merchant ships no longer steamed south for oil or rice. Most lay shattered beneath the waves, their routes erased from the maps that once defined an empire. What armies and air fleets could not destroy, the unseen hunters had suffocated. Convoys vanished without a trace. Tankers erupted into pillars of fire, and sailors came to dread the whisper of torpedoes more than the thunder of bombs. When victory came, the men who had made that silence possible returned without ceremony. There were no grand parades for the submariners, no headlines, no flags in city squares. They had fought in shadows and remained there, their triumph measured not in territory gained, but in ships sunk and nations starved. Yet their achievement was total. In the vastness of the Pacific, they had turned the absence of sound into the deadliest weapon of all. Today, the waters between Luzon and Formosa seem calm, blue, and empty. Few who cross them think of the steel tombs below, the convoys that never arrived, the submariners who never surfaced. But the silence still speaks. It is the same silence that ended an empire, a reminder that the ocean remembers, even when men forget.